Thank you for inviting me to address you on this very important topic of the controlled demolition of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. The fact of the demolition of these buildings has been consistently denied by all government and mass media since the day of the attack. The New York Times, writing the day after the attack, that, quote, hijackers ran jetliners into each of New York's World Trade Center towers yesterday, toppling both in a hellish storm of ash, glass, smoke, and leaping victims, as if the plane crashes and the subsequent collapses of these huge skyscrapers were the same event. However, there were 56 and 102 minutes between the times of the jetliner crashes and the respective collapses of the towers. So what actually happened on 9/11/01 is that we had the three most destructive events were the total collapse of World Trade Center Building 2, the South Tower, total collapse of the North Tower about a half an hour later, and 7 hours after that, the implosion of World Trade Center Building 7. The official story would have you to believe that these three events were all the consequences, directly or indirectly, of the plane crashes. My job today is to convince you that these were controlled demolitions, which is a very important point because the realization that these buildings came down not as a result of the jet crashes that were supposedly piloted by suicide extremists, Islamists who attacked us because they hated us, it completely invalidates the entire official story, because in order to accomplish the controlled demolition of these buildings, it was necessary to have access to the underlying infrastructure of the building, to get to the columns of the buildings in order to bring them down. Osama bin Laden didn't have that access. There's no conceivable way he could have. It proves that the entirety of the 9/11/01 attack was an inside job. Now, I'm using a set of slides here that is more extensive than the talk I'm going to be giving, so I'm going to be zooming into a few parts of this presentation. I'm going to make several major points. One, that the official investigations are fraudulent and entailed criminal destruction of evidence. Two, that Building 7 was demolished by controlled demolition. I'll spend very little time on that, but I'll spend a lot of time on providing evidence that the Twin Towers were demolished through controlled demolition, looking at three aspects to that. Number one, the official explanations are ludicrous. They don't explain the total collapse of these buildings by any stretch. Number two, the evidence indicates demolition. When you look at the physical features of the collapses, they have all the signature features of controlled demolition. How likely is it that they could have been brought down any other way if those features never show up in any event other than controlled demolition? So you have three buildings that show all those aspects. And third, there are simple proofs that demonstrate that these buildings could only have come down through controlled demolition. Now, so to the first part, which was about the need for an investigation and what was actually done instead of an investigation. The nature of these events warranted the most serious, painstaking, careful investigation probably in the history of any incident in the world, within the logic of the official story, which is that these three buildings just crumbled as a result of horrible structural failures. Because when you compare what happened to those buildings to all the engineering history of steel frame buildings, which has been in use for over 100 years, there's nothing that even looks remotely like these. Even buildings destroyed by earthquakes, steel frame buildings sometimes topple in response to very severe earthquakes. Sometimes it knocks them off their foundation. There's large portions of buildings maybe lying on the street, but it doesn't produce anything that looks like ground zero, which basically looks like a crater. The buildings were shredded, it smoked for months. No natural cause, fires, earthquakes, anything can create a result like that. So there's never been any natural force that can completely destroy skyscrapers except for earthquakes, and they don't produce that kind of destruction. But on 9/11/01, we're supposed to believe that it was fires primarily that brought down these buildings. That too is inconsistent with engineering history, because if you look at any of a number of examples, like the 91 One Meridian Plaza fire in Philadelphia, it burned for 18 hours, got at 8 floors of this building, didn't even damage a vertical column of this building, nor did the severe fires that burned in the First Interstate Bank building in Los Angeles even damage a single vertical column of these buildings. So certainly, it's given how far these events were from anything we would expect to happen from those causes, it justified the most concerted investigation, which is about the opposite of what actually happened, because FEMA took over the site. That's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they assembled their own investigative team from the American Society of Civil Engineers. But this was an investigation in name only, because the investigators didn't have subpoena power. They weren't even allowed access to the crime scene except for what was described as a guided tour. They only looked at a few pieces of steel at the salvage yards. They didn't even get access to the engineering drawings of the building initially, it looks like. They saved 156 pieces from the millions of pieces at ground zero for further study. And when their investigation was over, they wrote up a report. It was published on May of 2002, and it called for further research, investigation, and analysis. But how interesting that by the time this report was published, ground zero had been systematically scrubbed. The steel was removed from the site. The city accepted a plan from Controlled Demolition Incorporated for removing and recycling the steel. A mere 11 days after the attack, it was sold as scrap metal for low cost, sold to companies that then sold it to India and China. And the steel was rapidly loaded onto barges and ships and shipped out to mostly to Asia. Some of the steel went through the salvage yards, but it's not clear how much. The net result was that there's basically nothing left of all this structural steel, the thing that you'd want to look at to figure out what happened to these buildings. Now, so there was no real investigation, and there was an investigation later by NIST, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But first of all, I'm next going to go through and just very briefly look at Building 7, which is a building in World Trade Center by address only, because it was across the street from the Twin Towers. And when this building came down 5:20 in the afternoon, just suddenly, precipitously glided into its footprint with all the features of a controlled demolition. So I don't think there's that much to say about Building 7. I mean, if anybody who's seen a controlled demolition of a large building and then watches the video of Building 7 and sees the precise way in which this building went straight down and the speed at which it went down, meaning that virtually all the resistance in the building had been eliminated, and the fact that it created this very tidy rubble pile, all the things that a controlled demolition seeks to achieve through precise placement and timing of explosives. So that said, let's move on to the Twin Towers, because whereas I find that people relatively easily understand that Building 7 was a demolition, just because it looks so much like a conventional demolition, I find that people have much more resistance to understanding that the collapses of the Twin Towers were a demolition, because they don't look exactly like a conventional demolition. For one thing, they exploded from the top down, not the bottom up, and they exploded out with a huge amount of energy. The main difference between the way the Twin Towers were destroyed and a conventional demolition is that much more energy was used to destroy the Twin Towers. So it was more of a demolition event. So the next thing that I want to look at is the official explanations for the collapses of the Twin Towers. I'll just run through these really quickly and point out why they don't explain the collapses. And in this section, I'm going to just be considering the issue of total collapse of these buildings in the abstract, not looking at all the physical features, but just asking, is there any way that the plane crashes and fires could have totally collapsed these buildings? Well, all of the official explanations, all the government reports and all mainstream news media have embraced a whole series of explanations, and they all have in common that there's basically this idea of a pancake theory, a domino effect, chain reaction of the building crushing itself from the top to the bottom. And the most ludicrous version of this is the idea that the fires melted the cores of the steel core columns of the building, and that caused them to come down. That's not actually, that theory isn't embraced by an official government report. So I'll go on and talk more about the more serious theories, like the column failure theory, which was endorsed by a scientific paper that was published on September 13th, 2001. So one wonders what kind of peer review process that was subjected to, but this paper really doesn't reveal anything but the author's ignorance of the design of these buildings and of structural engineering in general, because they seem to suggest that building over design ratios, that's the added strength that a building is built with above and beyond what it's expected to meet, and it's the most serious forces that it's expected to encounter, are more like 5 to 1 or 10 to 1, not 2 to 1. This column failure theory, the idea that the columns were the first thing that failed, was out of the box right away. But it has a lot of serious problems, like the fact that in order for the columns to fail, they would have to be elevated to such a high temperature, around 700 degrees Celsius, and even then, you wouldn't get a simultaneous failure like you'd need to bring down the buildings, but still the steel would be glowing red hot, you'd have ongoing window breakage and big bright emergent red flames. But in the case of both towers, the fires, especially in the south tower, were never that severe. This is the most severe they ever were, never even grew to the other side of the building. And so how could that produce this total precipitous collapse or weaken the columns to that point when there's no precedent for it? And in fact, studies that have been done on the effect of severe fires on uninsulated steel structure, such as one done by Core's Construction, found the highest temperatures in any of the steelwork was only 360 degrees Celsius in similar kinds of fires. Now that's a long way from 700 Celsius. But the most important thing to realize about any column failure theory is that it wouldn't level the towers. Any event, even if you could have fires that were so severe they somehow could compromise the strength of the steel and something would collapse, it wouldn't cause this straight down telescoping collapse like you see in the North Tower, because what happens is the top of the building just glides straight down into itself, maintaining symmetry. And the whole purpose of controlled demolition is to achieve that result, get the building to go straight down, which of course no natural event will induce, because for the building to fall down would require it to follow the path of maximum resistance. So because of the obvious deficiencies in the column failure theory, we were treated with the truss failure theory, which blames the failure of these web trusses, which held up the floor diaphragms, which were these rings that connected the core structures of the building to the perimeter structures. And supposedly there were according to Professor Eager of MIT, material scientist professor, there was an unzipping chain reaction of the connections of the trusses to the columns failing, and then the floors failing in a pancaking chain reaction, and just brought the whole building down. And it uses very deceptive techniques to sell this story. Like they have the schematic of the building in which the core structure of the building is replaced by a series of horizontal slabs rather than the vertical columns that were actually there. So all kinds of tricks to make you think that this could actually happen. The truss failure was most importantly endorsed by FEMA's report, the one that I was talking, that was the one that we had the American Society for Civil Engineers, volunteer engineers coming up with this theory. And this theory isn't even believable at all, because even if you accept this idea of the floors pancaking, that would leave the columns standing, and the columns would have to fail too for the entire building to fail. And they say that there were tall freestanding portions of the exterior columns, and then they failed. But look, there's no tall freestanding columns anywhere. The columns are the only evidence you see of columns is little chunks of columns being hurled out in all directions. So they misrepresent the building too. The FEMA and virtually all the reports, in one way or another, misrepresent the cores of these buildings, because the core is the thing that most obviously disproves this idea that the buildings could just fall straight down through themselves, because these could hold up several times the weight of the entire building. And they misrepresent it by calling it a service core, deceptive illustrations that imply that the core didn't even exist. Other more deceptive illustrations that show the core columns at a fraction of their actual dimensions. Other ones that show a column that's obviously not a core column, as if it is. It only has about half the dimensions. So in fact, the towers had these huge core structures. There's 47 steel box columns. They were 36 inches by 16 inches outside dimensions. And it invalidates the collapse theory, any of these collapse theories, because even if there was extensive damage to the outside of the building, it wouldn't have heated up, it wouldn't have caused enough damage to the core for that to fail simultaneously, and certainly you couldn't have had both the core and the exterior all the columns failing simultaneously to produce these telescoping collapses that happened in both towers. The truss failure theory is basically a diversion, because it's this complicated theory of one kind of failure leading to another, and it was later replaced again by the column failure theory. So the most recent report we have is by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which released a report just this year, and they've gone back to embrace the core column theories. I mean, the column failure theories. So they can't seem to decide whether they like the trusses to fail first or the columns to fail first. They keep going back and forth. But they don't begin to explain the total collapse of these buildings. Because think about it, these are the only examples of total progressive collapse, supposedly, ever observed, where a structure crushes itself starting from the top, and the crushing just goes all the way down the building and crushes the whole building to nothing. That's technically called top-down total progressive collapse, and there's not a single example of it outside of the alleged cases of the Twin Towers. Now, if you can't produce a phenomenon, then it's not scientific to say the phenomenon exists, because the scientific method says that you have to be able to reproduce a phenomenon in order for it to be real. So, okay, so that was the portion of my talk, very abbreviated, describing what's wrong with the official theories. And I think the next two sections are more important because these are direct evidence of demolition, not just saying that they can't come up with an explanation. These features that were documented by the numerous photographs and videos taken of these events show that they had this explosiveness, all these features like this. The blast waves were so intense that they just blew out the windows all throughout these financial center buildings that were 400 feet away from the nearest tower. It hurled debris, and this is like 400 feet up in the tower, just explosively hurled in all directions, steel pieces being blown as far as 500 feet radially, all directions from the towers. Demolition squibs are features seen in controlled demolitions where puffs of dust suddenly emerge from the facade. And these are seen clearly in the North Tower. They're much more apparent when you watch a video, and these squibs just instantly pop out of the building with velocities of maybe 100 feet per second. They just shoot out of the building by 100 feet. And they're well below the area of complete destruction. So these couldn't possibly be caused by floors falling down and squeezing out air, because if that's the case, then what's generating all this pulverized concrete up here? The floors are the only concrete element in these buildings. And yet you have these high velocity gas ejections occurring as much as 20 stories below the zone where the whole building is just breaking up. The way I describe what happened to the towers is that they were, I don't think you can get around calling these explosions. They exploded into these clouds of dust with steel hurling in all directions. And these explosions became over 500 feet in diameter by the time they reached the ground. Actually more like 800 feet in diameter. But the reason I think people don't think of them as explosions is because they occurred over a period of 15 seconds in either case. So there wasn't a particularly, normally people think of an explosion as you hear a loud crack, a bang, and then it's just that one event. But if you have, in the case of a demolition where you might have thousands of explosions that are all blending in, then you get one huge explosive event, but you don't hear any distinct explosions that's so much above the roar of it. The thing sounded sort of like an ocean wave, just this incredibly loud roar. But incredibly explosive. The tops, I described them as mushrooming because they blew out so far. This is the North Tower, and this distance here is about 120 feet. The tower is 207 feet across the face. So and this is only a few seconds into the collapse, and this stuff is being hurled out with a lot of lateral energy to be thrown that far out. And they mushroom, and this cloud just becomes larger and larger as it goes straight down to the ground. The symmetry is probably the most telling element. I spoke a little bit about that earlier, in that they followed the vertical axis of the building. The destruction followed the axis of the building in both cases all the way down. Even in the case of the South Tower, where the top had started to lean for 2 seconds, and then it just disintegrated and just went all straight down to the ground. Hurling debris in all directions. The steel skeleton was shattered and thrown for distances up to 500 feet. The FEMA itself illustrated the fallout pattern. So again, I emphasize that natural phenomena follow the path of least resistance, not the path of maximum resistance. So this is not possibly a natural event, that the tower is just falling down. It's being systematically destroyed. That's the only explanation for the symmetry. Each tower disappeared into a volcano-like cloud of dust. I mean, the comparison of these events to volcanoes is very telling. It was like, when these towers came down, the dust was so thick that it was pitch black on the streets. And the clouds are thick too. Hanschel talks about this photographer talks about being picked up and carried a block by the dust. It was so thick. And the dust was apparently had the 90,000 tons of concrete in each tower just pulverized into dust so fine that it stays suspended in the air for a few minutes. So the non-metallic objects in the towers were pulverized to fine dust, including the bodies of people, which 1,000 of which were never even recovered, even though they were looking at little tiny dust samples and using advanced DNA techniques. But the only recognizable objects at Ground Zero were pieces of metal. that aren't so easily destroyed. There's just shards of metal as if the buildings were just shredded. They were just shredded, and the dust was inches deep as far as blocks away from ground zero. That's what happened. The people, the gypsum, the concrete, is all in this dust all over the Manhattan. So very few pieces of steel were longer than 30 feet. It made it very convenient for the cleanup operation. They could load it on trucks without cutting it up. And there was this intense heat that persisted for over 100 days. Ground zero smoldered into December because there was so much residual heat. So all those are features of controlled demolition, maybe features that are beyond controlled demolition in terms of the excess heat, in terms of the degree of pulverization. But that's all the more evidence that these were controlled demolitions, because to get an event that's even more destructive, you need to put even more energy into the explosives, presumably, that pulverize these buildings. Now, the final section is to actually break it down into proofs. Here's an argument that shows, here's a series of arguments that actually shows that demolition is the only plausible explanation. The first one is just to look at the pulverization of the concrete. What you see in the case of both buildings is this intense pulverization, this white clouds of concrete. These are clouds of concrete and gypsum. And by the distribution, by the opacity of these clouds as they're being ejected, by the distribution of mass around these buildings, I mean, they didn't just fall straight down on the footprints, they radiated out all over the place. And probably just a small fraction of the mass was within the actual footprints of the buildings. And especially the concrete, which is just all over the streets. Apparently, virtually all the concrete in these buildings was thoroughly pulverized. There's 4-inch thick concrete floor slabs on every floor in the 110 floors of each of these towers, and there's no evidence of any macroscopic chunks of concrete at ground zero. I mean, you can scour the images, and all you see is dust and chunks of steel. So this is entirely counterintuitive, because if you were to take a concrete block and drop it from, let's say, the roof of the tower, I'm sure it would smash into a lot of small pieces, but it wouldn't turn into microscopic powder, where the particles are less than 100 microns in diameter. But you need a lot of, explosive energy applied consistently throughout the building to achieve that. This proof, I think, is the one that I think most people get. And this has to do with looking at the way the building came down and the rate at which it came down, but specifically at which the rates of different parts of the rubble came down. So if you were to drop a brick off the roof of the tower in a vacuum, it would take 9.2 seconds to reach the ground. The towers came down completely in 13 to 16 seconds. So by 16 seconds, everything is down. So that's only about 50% longer than gravitational free fall. And that's true of all the stuff that's falling through the air. So the only thing that's slowing down all this stuff outside the profile of the building is air. So the air is slowing things down by, say, 30 to 50 to 60%. But if you look at the inside of the profile of the building, everything's coming down in here, too, at the same rate. Well, but wait a minute. This is falling freely through the air, and it's 100 feet out from the building. It's been falling for a long time. It's falling freely through the air, and even big chunks of steel are falling, at this rate, being slowed down only by air. But here, inside the building, remember, all this mass of the building is supposedly crushing itself, but yet it's coming down at the same rate as the rubble falling through the air. So the non sequitur here is, to believe the official story, you have to believe that all this intact, cold, incredibly strong steel structure that was so strong it can hold this building up in a horizontal crosswind of 100 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour, and yet the building is providing all that steel structure is providing no more resistance to falling rubble than air is. So it's it's just ludicrous to think that the steel structure would just be crumbling, just self-destructing. That's what it would have to be. It would have to be a self-destructing building. There's another proof that's much more complicated. It has to do with just looking at the energy requirements needed to expand the dust clouds. Because if you look at, there's photographs that show the development of these dust clouds, and this one is 30 seconds after the start of the North Tower collapse. And I do a precise estimate, or not that precise, but I look at the at reference points in the dust cloud, and make an estimate. And this cloud by 30 seconds is about 5 times the volume of the building. And there's two main ways that can happen. One is that the turbulence can increase the size of the dust cloud, but to the extent that can't, then all the rest of the expansion has to be provided thermally, by thermal energy evaporating moisture and by just causing thermodynamic expansion. And I come up with an estimate for the total energy requirements of the expansion just of the dust cloud that's well over 10 times the entire elevated mass of the building. That's the gravitational potential energy that is supposedly driving all this destruction. Doesn't even come close to satisfying this energy sink, let alone all those other energy sinks like crushing all that concrete, which would also probably require a lot more than the total mass of the building. And the final proof, and this one I think is also fairly easy to understand, has to do with looking at the way that the top of the south tower came down. Now it first started to tilt, but what you see if you look at it carefully is that it starts to tilt, but right at about this point, the tilting stops as it's going into the dust cloud and actually starts to right itself. That contradicts the law of conservation of angular momentum, barring demolition, because the fulcrum would have been causing it to rotate faster. So the only explanation is that the entire top of the building has been shredded, presumably by demolition, and that's what caused it to stop rotating because the moment of inertia was destroyed. So the conclusion of this is that looking at the physical evidence, at showing the features of demolition, proofs of demolition, and as well as, of course, the total bankruptcy of the official explanations and the fraudulence of the official investigations, leads me to conclude unequivocally that the Twin Towers in Building 7 were all deliberately destroyed through controlled demolition that was not a result of the plane crashes and fires.